What's up, everybody? Hope you're having a great day. My name is Reber, and welcome to another episode of The Process, a podcast where we talk about creative stuff and kind of what it takes to create things and what all goes into it, and just little insights that we learn along the way. Today I want to talk about something that I've found pretty fascinating as I've kind of gone through different creative processes and different creative fields, and I think it's something that'll kind of help you guys out as well. And to illustrate this point, I'm just going to tell a quick story here. So, about a couple, 5-6 months ago or so, I saw the movie La La Land for the first time. And I was just blown away by this movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a great movie. But the reason why I liked it, there's a lot of reasons why I liked it. I thought it was super well filmed. I thought it was, beautifully edited. I thought that the music was spectacular. I thought basically everything about it was super, super well done. Immediately one of my favorite movies. I've seen it in quite a while. But the reason why I liked it is, I think I mentioned this before, I was kind of a band geek growing up, and I was super into jazz music, which is kind of weird for people my age, but being into jazz obviously made it so I had kind of a personal connection to that movie. Kind of seemed a little more interesting to me, at least, because there's a part in the movie where he's basically explaining why jazz is important to him and why he finds it interesting, why he finds it new and innovative every single time, and why it's so great. And it was funny because I'm watching the movie and I swear I've had this conversation with people, especially my wife. I turned to her and said right during that scene, it was like, honey, we've had this conversation before, because I feel like jazz is often very misunderstood and people view it as this boring thing, which that's fine. I get it. If you're not interested in it, that's fine. I'm not trying to force people to like jazz. But as a creative person, I learned quite a bit from the art that is jazz. And I kind of want to talk about that. So if you actually study jazz a little bit, you'll realize that it's an extremely complicated form of music, right? There's a lot going on, and you really, really need to know your stuff in order to be able to play jazz well. Because essentially in jazz, there's something called improv, right? So improvisation. And basically what you're doing is you're making stuff up on the spot. But it's not just making stuff up, just out of nowhere. It's very focused, and it's very inspired, because you're really taking ideas from people who are playing with you, and you're kind of feeding off of each other, and you're going with it, but everything is within the structure of the song. And if it ever strays away from that, it's done for a very specific reason, and then usually it comes back, and there's a lot that goes into that. And if you haven't studied music much before, music is very structured. Everything is very mathematical. It makes a lot of sense, and jazz kind of strays away from that, which scares a lot of people. And that's part of why it kind of sounds weird at times to people who don't know much about music, because it sounds like they're playing wrong notes. It sounds like they're playing weird patterns and rhythms that don't really make sense. And that's just kind of what jazz is. But to people who are really trained in music a lot, it's a really refreshing change of pace, because you're going away from the very mathematical, structured forms of music. You're a little more, free form, a little free flowing, and just kind of you get that freedom that you don't normally get in, orchestras and classical piano and things like that, which are beautiful. But as I mentioned, very methodical, basically mathematic. I say mathematic because people who do well at music are often pretty good at math too, because essentially what you're doing as a musician is adding, multiplying, dividing all the time really quick, because notes are, whole notes, which are for 4 beats, and then all the way down to, 16th, 32nd, 64th notes, which basically you're just doing division, the whole time, dividing notes in half, multiplying them, things like that. So that's why I say mathematical, but it's very, very structured. A lot of rules. And jazz doesn't really have that. There's rules to jazz, and you really need to know your stuff to be able to do jazz, because you need to understand all of the structure of music and know when you can step away from it, and when you can tweak it, and when you can kind of take some liberties, so to speak. And that's really what I want to talk about. Something that's really amazed me as I've kind of learned about a lot of these different art forms, whether it be music or photography, videography, things like that, even cooking, right? there's a lot of rules, right? And as you're learning, you need to understand the rules. You need to understand the fundamentals, the basics, because without that foundation, you really can't, do much else, right? So when jazz artists were really starting to get famous, the very classically trained people really didn't like it at first. And they really looked down on jazz artists because a lot of them, in their view, were basically ruining this beautiful structure and all the rules of music. So they would criticize these jazz artists as people who didn't know what they were doing. Oh, you're playing those wrong notes because you don't know better. Oh, you didn't follow this rule because you weren't taught at the best music school. Things like that. And what a lot of jazz artists would do was they would purposely put in little bits and pieces into their songs that were taken from classical pieces. Like, so for example, right, this could be, I'm not saying this ever happened, but for example, you can get a guy like Miles Davis, very famous jazz musician, and he could have like thrown in a little piece of something from Bach or Beethoven into one of his solos, right? Not the whole thing, just a little piece, just to show all those critics, hey man, I know what I'm doing, right? So I'm breaking the rules here and I'm doing my own thing. It's not because I don't know what I'm doing and I'm just winging it. It's because I want to. I'm doing it intentionally to explore and really push this art form, right? Which is something that you don't get in a lot of other types of music. And that kind of draws me back to what we as creative people need to learn, right? We need to understand the basics. We need to learn the fundamentals and know them so well that we can do them just as well as anyone else. But once you get to that point, you got to be able to push it. You got to break the rules a little bit. But don't break the rules because you don't know the rules or because you're not good enough to follow the rules. Break the rules for a stylistic, creative reason, right? So for example, if you're doing videography, right, there's a lot of rules that you need to follow, right? You need to make sure your shutter speed's about right around double what your frame rate is, right? You need to make sure you're filming with the right ISO and the right f-stop and things like that, right? There's rules for it. And when it comes to like cinematography, there's a lot of rules when it comes to the way you film close-ups versus medium shots and a lot of other stuff that I'm not any expert in by any means. So don't take my word for a lot of stuff, but there's rules, right? Same with photography. There's a lot of rules about how you properly expose things and composition and things like that, right? And I know there's tons of rules when it comes to literature, and you got to understand these basics. But then the true beauty is when an artist is able to understand those basics and know all the rules and then put his own spin on things, right? Put his or her little tweak on whatever art form it is they use, right? You look at some of the most famous painters of all time. They didn't necessarily follow all the rules, right? So the reason why I highlighted jazz on this is because I've been thinking about La La Land recently. It's a great movie. I love it. And people who actually talk to me like in person, they know I'm borderline obsessed with the movie. But it's something I've really learned from jazz, and I feel like jazz is the great one to highlight here because a lot of people who don't understand jazz just think it's people playing wrong notes and kind of winging it and doing their own thing. They don't realize that for the most part, most of these jazz musicians are classically trained, and they're using this almost as an escape from the structure and mathematical whatever of classical music, right? It's not to disrespect classical music at all. It's just a different form of creative expression. And it's really cool. It's actually really fun. If you get into it a lot, you'll see that the sheet music, right, where all the notes are written. And like classical pieces, it's very clean. It's very, structured, good font, all really well done. And then like jazz sheet music is purposely done with like whatever handwritten font it is, and the notes look a little sloppy and stuff. Like they make it look casual almost on purpose, right? Like the whole idea is it's supposed to be kind of this escape. You know the rules, you know what to do, now put your own spin on it, right? So I think the same thing can be said of basically every art form, and as creative people we need to get that, right? You need to practice the basics, you need to know the rules, you need to get those fundamentals so you have a good foundation. But once you have it, don't feel restricted, right? Don't feel like you are locked in to those rules, because remember, the whole reason a lot of us are doing this creative stuff is for self-expression in the first place, right? So if you feel super locked into all those rules, then you're not then that kind of defeats the point, right? You need to be able to express yourself, however that may come, and really, just don't feel restricted to the rules. And if you're gonna break the rules, though, don't just break them for, oh yeah, I messed up, I didn't follow that rule, whatever, no big deal. No, do it for a reason. You know what I mean? So like if you're gonna mess with the frame rate on a camera, right? Do it because you want it to look that way. Right? That's your expression. That's a creative choice, not a, oh, I messed up my frame rate, I forgot to do something. You know, that's different, right? So and that's exactly what jazz teaches you. I hit that note. It might have sounded wrong to you, but I had a reason for doing it. I wanted to throw that in there right then at that time because this is what I was trying to express, right? And that's kind of where I'm going with that. So if there's one thing you can take away from this episode is go like jazz music more. No, just kidding. But what I'm trying to say is don't feel locked into these rules that you hear, right? I watch a lot of like tutorial videos, right? Don't feel locked into them. You got to know them. You got to know the basics. You got to be so good at them that you can basically do them in your sleep, so to speak. But if you're going to break the rules, feel free to break the rules, but do it because you want to, not because you messed up, not because you forgot something. And as creative people, I think we need to remember that the whole reason we got into this in the first place was for creative expression. Don't feel restricted. Express yourself, but do so thoughtfully. And then, so that's kind of what I want to get at today. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. Remember, I'm going to try to bring some people on and have people talk about some of the struggles they go through as creatives, what inspires them, and really kind of get this community built up a little bit more. I really appreciate the feedback so far, everyone. If you're listening at this point, I know we're like almost 10 minutes in or whatever, so thank you for taking the time. I know it's a big chunk of your day, so I really do appreciate it. If there's any questions or comments or whatever, please feel free to leave them below. I always appreciate the feedback, and thank you so much for the feedback I've gotten so far. Like and subscribe, as always, and be sure to follow me on all the social media links below. I'm going to try to put this on SoundCloud too, eventually. No promises. So that way you can listen to it on the go or whatever. So that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next episode. Peace.